Felly noswaith dda bawb. Good evening everyone. Fe'n yw Elin ac rwy'n un o'r swyddogion datblygu ar gyfer tîm cyswllt ffermio. My name's Elin and I'm one of the Farming Connect Development Officers. Yn gyntaf, hoffwn i groesawu chi gyd yma i'r gwebinar heno, sef chwalu camargraffiadau yn ymwneud â charbon ar ein ffermydd da byw. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to the Carbon Myth Busting on Livestock Farms webinar. Ac am mwyn arbed ydyg amser, fe wnaed just boi'r Saesneg os ydy hynna'n iawn. So tonight, Helen Evans from ADAS will be joining us to discuss the key sources of emissions on livestock farms, the carbon balance, which includes storing and sequestration, and what do carbon calculators do and how can you use them. Just before we hand over to Helen, if you've joined some of our past webinars, I'm sure you're all aware of how Zoom works by now. But this meeting will be recorded, and if you'd like to ask any questions throughout the presentation, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come to them at the end of the presentation. So Farming Connect have a large range of services available that might be of interest to you at this current time. Our advisory service enables you to have bespoke advice ranging from business planning, feasibility studies, along to more technical advice such as soil and grassland advice, nutrition, and more recently, carbon audits. These can be tailored to your needs and are available on a one-to-one basis, which are 80% funded, or on a group basis, which is a minimum of 3 businesses and can be fully funded. The Farming Connect training window is also open at the moment up until the 25th of June. Here you can apply for up to 80% funding on over 70 courses, and the full list of all the courses can be found on our website. And we also offer one-to-one hour-long surgeries that are fully funded, which can help you with any inquiries that you may have on different topics. Some of the topics include business, carbon footprinting, animal nutrition and animal health, just to name a few. But if you would like to make the most of any of these services, please be sure to contact your local development officers. Their details are on screen now, or alternatively contact the Farming Connect Service Centre. And can I also encourage you all to fill in the webinar feedback form at the end of the webinar. There's space here as well for you to include any inquiries or further questions that you may have following on tonight's presentation. And there we are. I think that's enough from me. If that's all right, I'd like to hand over to our speaker tonight, which is Helen Evans. And over to you. I'll just stop sharing.
Right. Okay, diolch Helen. Okay, I'll just set up my presentation. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to chat through and talk to, with yourselves about carbon and myth busting on livestock farms. It felt like this was a really appropriate topic considering the amount of discussion there is now within the agricultural industry about carbon. And I certainly have found it useful to try and get some clarity for myself in terms of the work that I do with farmers in Wales and wider around what the different terms mean. And I thought that that would be useful for yourselves to hear as well. So thank you to Farming Connect and Mentor Business for providing us that opportunity. Just to introduce myself, my name's Helen Evans. I work for ADAS in out of the Aberystwyth office, and I work mostly with farmers in Wales, but also elsewhere. Dwi'n siarad Cymraeg, felly mae hwnna'n defnyddiol hefyd wrth gwrs yng Nghymru. But I'll operate predominantly in the medium of English for this evening, if that's okay. And ADAS is an organisation that very likely many of you have had some input from via Cyswllt Ffermio, via Farming Connect, but it is an organisation that's been around for a long time as a consultancy operating across the UK. And we have some level of track record regarding carbon and carbon emissions. We provide updates to the greenhouse gas emissions climate change inventory for the UK. We're responsible for updating some carbon calculator tools that are used across the world. And we do a range of greenhouse gas modelling for a range of customers, including Welsh governments, the likes of the levy bodies, and then also commercial organisations, retailers, and food processors as well, both within the UK and internationally. So we've got a really good set of skills within the organisation, both in terms of looking at modelling around greenhouse gas emissions and seeing how to get the most accurate amount of information to try and make decisions on a farm scale or a regional or a national scale, but also our experience with working with farmers to try and help them start to capture some of their own information regarding their carbon footprint, which is mostly what I'm going to be talking about this evening. So, a little bit of background, we've done that. I wanted to give you, discuss the source of emissions on farm, start to talk a little bit about the misconceptions and some of the frequently asked questions, cover those, spend a bit of time talking about carbon sequestration, and then try and tackle this difference between what's called GWP 100 versus GWP star. So that's Global Warming Potential 100, which is a methodology used globally, versus one that's being discussed particularly around methane called GWP star. Spend a little bit of time talking about calculators, carbon calculators, and the pros and cons of those, what might be useful for yourselves if you're thinking about doing this or you've already had a go at it yourselves, and then maybe move on to some questions and discussion. And I have to say that none of us, I suppose, are global warming carbon experts. If I can't answer your question today, we'll make sure that we try and get back to you with some clarity around the area that you're asking for some more detail on. We'll do that via Farming Connect, and you can get in touch with me directly yourselves. Okay, so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the basic terminology and what that actually means. So, when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, these are referring to three main greenhouse gases. So that's carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And in the context of agriculture, it's thinking about the release of those into the atmosphere as a result of activity on the farm. And all farming activity produces emissions. And it's very likely that there'll be a mix of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide on the farm. If you're predominantly a livestock farm, then there's a much higher percentage of methane that's coming out of that farming system. And if you're a farm that uses high levels of fertilizer in particular, then there may be a high level of nitrous oxide going on with those systems. But in general, all farms produce, to a lesser or greater extent, some percentage across all three of these. So that's what, when they talk about GHG, greenhouse gases, greenhouse gas emissions, that's what they're referring to: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And the CO2, the carbon dioxide, is the one that it tends to be used as a term, but I'll explain a little bit about how the other two are mixed into that in terms of the terminology. So carbon store, the store of carbon, this is the carbon that's predominantly stored in the soils and the vegetation already present on the farm. And then carbon sequestration, this is to do with the active removal of carbon from the atmosphere, and then looking to permanently lock this up in the farm, on the farm, in the resources on the farm, either through vegetation or through the soil organic carbon. So it's a permanent locking up of and drawing it out of the atmosphere into those features on the farm. And then the other term that's been used a lot within the industry at the moment is this term net zero. And that's looking at this balance between the amount of greenhouse gas that's produced by agriculture and the amount that's removed from the atmosphere by agricultural activities or other activities on those farms, to try and get that balance between emissions and what's sequestered. So that's where the term net zero comes from. And the industry has signed up to moving towards net zero within a relatively short space of time, with some strong aspirations. But a lot of those interventions that we'll talk about a bit later in terms of sequestering or reducing emissions are ones that are directly associated with activities that you probably already do on the farm, that either need to be captured better in terms of data assessment, or maybe are ones that you need to increase activity if you're interested in doing so on the farm yourself. I.e., it pretty much comes down to production efficiency. That tends to be one of the big areas that most farms can contribute towards net zero at the moment in terms of moving towards that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about these agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. As I said, we've got these three main emissions that come off the agricultural system. And all three greenhouse gases have different impacts on warming. and this is called their global warming potential, GWP. So the higher the number, the greater the warming effect is for this gas. And carbon dioxide is used as the baseline for this, with the other gases described in terms of equivalent CO2. So you often see the term CO2e, as you can see on the screen there. So carbon dioxide equivalents. So if 1 kilogram of nitrous oxide has 265 times the warming effect of 1 kilogram of CO2, and 1 kilogram of methane has a warming effect of 20 times greater than 1 kilogram of CO2. So that's where that information comes from. And that's also where you can see some of this dialogue around people talking about methane being more toxic than carbon dioxide, or nitrous oxide being more toxic than carbon dioxide. This is where some of that comes from in terms of understanding what the global warming potential is associated with that. So when the impacts are calculated and presented as a single footprint, so they're calculated into this CO2 equivalent, then you're in a position where that can be used to assess a carbon footprint using one figure for CO2 equivalent, which is merging these and presenting it as a single footprint using this carbon dioxide equivalent feature associated with it. So let's talk a little bit about where the stores are, where emissions happen, and where sequestration happens on the farm. This is a mixed farming system. I would imagine that most of you on this call are beef and sheep farmers with predominantly a grassland system, but I have got a mixed system here. And there's a little bit about some arable systems within this presentation, just so you can get you can get some context around where livestock systems sit alongside the other systems within agriculture. So this is a typical highly mixed farm. You've got nitrous oxide coming off grazing from animals grazing, and that's from the emissions associated with that. You've got nitrous oxide coming from the applications of organic and inorganic manures. The artificial fertilizer aspect of things is one of the biggies in terms of producing nitrous oxide. And again, that's one of the big areas where particularly arable systems or intensive systems, grassland systems that are using high levels of N, that would be where that's coming from, and to a lesser extent also from organic manures. Now we get methane, and methane comes from the enteric emissions. So that's from the living and breathing ruminants that we have on our systems. And then also from the manure associated with them in terms of the manure storage, whether that be in field or in sheds, in terms of, and then there are different levels of manure depending on methane emitted, depending on how that manure is stored. And then CO2 comes from heat and power used in sheds, the CO2 from the use of vehicles and machinery, and then also for using heat and power as part of the production system, then also that's emitted from that type of system as well. So buildings, lighting, heating, vehicles and machinery. We also have what are called embedded emissions. So these are the emissions on products that you're buying onto the farm. So they're coming as a ready-made product effectively. So you're buying those in. You haven't made those emissions happen. They've come with those products and have been part of the production process associated with making those products. So that would count as feed, it would count as bedding, fertilizer, and it's the growing, the manufacturing and the transportation of those products. And again, often associated with nitrogen fertilizer, so that's artificial fertilizer, there's quite high embedded emissions, nitrogen emissions associated with those, and that you're buying those in and then you're using them on the farm. So they're things that are captured as part of the carbon footprinting because there's something that you're choosing that you need for your production system on your farm. And then we've got sequestration. This is quite a harder area to quantify, but it's a really important area that we try and capture as an industry regarding how we're managing our carbon on our farms. So there's above ground sequestration, and the example I use within this context is particularly around trees and hedgerows, but also we have below ground sequestration where we're trying to increase our soil organic content. So you've got the carbon store, which is already there but then also, and looking to protect that, but also you've got the sequestration where you're trying to increase the amount of carbon that might be within those settings, either above ground or below ground. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I am going to do, this slide is about crops, it just helps provide a bit of context. The next slide is the one that we'll spend more time on looking in terms of different types of livestock systems. But this provides you an idea about the current total average associated with the kilograms of CO2 equivalent emitted per kilogram of products. So this is per kilogram of bread wheat, and then there's for bread wheat, and then also there's one there for per kilogram of potatoes produced. So you can see there that on average across the UK, we're looking at 0.64 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So that's looking at CO2, methane and nitrous oxide, and then put together as one blended figure per kilogram of bread wheat produced. And then for potatoes, we're looking at 0.6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of potato produced. Okay, so that gives you sort of an idea. And then here you can start to see that for bread wheat, more than half the emissions are from cultivations and the use of fertilizer. And the rest of it tend to be from most of it is from sort of embedded emissions from fertilizer production. So that fertilizer, that blue, darker blue fertilizer production third is effectively associated with the emissions associated with the fertilizer, the production of fertilizer before it's actually come onto the farm. And then the green soil NO2 emissions is associated with the application of that and the management of the soil associated with the cultivations. So you can see that the majority of the emissions associated with bread wheat are around the cultivation and the use of resources to ensure that you get a production system working there. There is electricity and fuel there, and in comparison to what you might see for some of the livestock systems, there that is a slightly higher equivalent, because again it's an arable system where there's a reasonably high level of fuel use associated with annual cultivations. But in comparison to potatoes, you can see potatoes, there's a much higher level of mechanical usage in terms of the cultivations. So therefore that yellow electricity and fuel is much higher. So the electricity is associated with the processing of the potatoes after harvest and the storage of potatoes, and then also a high volume of, there's a high volume of fuel there as well. Associated with the actual cultivations. But again, fertilizer production is a high percentage here in terms of it being over a quarter, closer to a third. So there are those embedded emissions, and the soil cultivation emissions as well is significant there as well. Okay. We'll move on to looking at different livestock systems here. And I've tried to provide a range of different systems for us to look at to start to compare how these systems look against each other, and then also how they, what their component parts are effectively. So if you look at livestock, you can see that the enteric emissions, the emissions associated with from the animals themselves, make up about half the emissions in both the suckler beef system and the extensive dairy operations. So that's the two on the left effectively. So that's that lighter blue colour. You can see that that's a significant amount. And then also you can see from the total value of CO2 equivalent per kilogram, the suckler beef system has a much higher volume of CO2 equivalent in comparison to, say, the dairy system. And indoor pigs is obviously a lot lower as well. So that gives an indication of where the likes of the suckler beef system sits in terms of total volume of emissions. But then within this, we can start to actually tease out where those emissions tend to be sitting. I hasten to add, all of these are averages. Every single farm has its own unique set of emissions, but this is an attempt just to try and look at comparisons across the sectors as a whole. And I'm certainly not looking to make any judgment statements here in terms of what's poor or good or bad. It's purely to do with trying to tease out where these figures are sitting. And what there is and what opportunities there are potentially for, one, capturing accurate data sets as a baseline, and then working towards potentially looking at reducing those carbon footprints if that's what you yourself as a farmer or potentially your supply chain that you participate in are interested in doing with you. So I would imagine the majority of you are looking around beef and sheep systems, so that suckler beef in particular will be of interest to you. Feed and bedding are major areas of emissions for all of these systems. Inevitably, they're all livestock based. Feeding and bedding is a fundamental part of what they do. But you can see here that you can start to compare how feeding and bedding is a much higher percentage of the emissions within a dairy beef system in comparison to a suckler beef system, where it's probably it's much lower in comparison to the other. And then obviously the indoor pigs, it's a very intensive system where you've got feed and bedding, and feed in particular being a really high proportion of that relatively low CO2 equivalent per kilogram, but nevertheless it's the feed side of things. And of course, a lot of that is associated with not just the volume of feed that's being used, but also the embedded emissions associated with that feed, very likely being in a situation where there's potentially quite a lot of soy within those feed mixes that are being used in order to get high kilograms of output associated with those. So manure management is around 20% for suckler and dairy beef. And then when the animals are housed, obviously manure management, it's in pigs, it's looking at over a quarter as well. And our dairy systems tend to have quite high fertilizer emissions associated with intensive grassland management systems. And in general, you'd say that energy emissions from energy tend to be relatively low across livestock systems in comparison to maybe arable systems where they tend to be a bit higher. So the things that tend to be real features of helping livestock production systems, particularly in Wales, try and have, although maybe the total kilograms of CO2 emissions per kilogram might be quite high, but within that, the areas and scope of actually looking to try and either articulate that the emissions are already relatively low in comparison to maybe other beef and sheep systems globally, or whether there are areas that people can actually improve on, tends to be energy, ensuring that energy level usage is low, which it often already is. There's often a high percentage of permanent pasture associated with those farms. If the farmer is interested in looking at tweaking their feed usage and where they source their feed from, and looking at increasing the volume of feed, home-produced feed, particularly with maybe the use of legumes. Looking at reducing fertilizer use, particularly N, as in artificial fertilizer use, and looking to try replace that or increase the amount of livestock manure that is used on farms as a replacement and alternative N source. Whether or not there's an opportunity there for reduction in cultivations, and then also looking at efficiency of livestock production. So most farms don't need to look at maybe reducing livestock numbers. There's still plenty to go at in terms of improving efficiency on those farms and being able to increase kilograms of output, potentially with a corresponding reduction in CO2 emissions, which then effectively would take that emission level even lower than it already is. There's some of the key areas that people can work on. So I then wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this concept of carbon sequestration. So that's a term that people find confusing or quite have strong opinions on. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking that through. So this is the active removal of carbon from the atmosphere, and it's associated with the long-term storage of that carbon in vegetation and soil. So if you're thinking about the recycling of carbon in terms of taking grass off your system and that being eaten by your livestock, and then that manure being deposited back onto that, that isn't sequestration. There's a cycle going on there. Sequestration is specifically around active removal of carbon from the atmosphere and then long-term storage of that within the system. So remember that graphic that we had, whether it could be something that's above ground or below ground. So talking about it within a vegetation system, so that biogenic C there, that's effectively referring to what is taken off by either in terms of silage or animals eating, and then it's put back in terms of the manure that's being put back onto the land. And if you've got a long-term system associated with that, where there isn't any high levels of cultivation, then that is a cyclical activity. But for sequestration, you're looking at a process of increasing the carbon long-term. So that's such as woody vegetation like trees and hedgerows, or long-term increases in carbon, soil carbon. Okay, let me explain here. So there's that rotation going round and round, as I explained. And then here we decided to plant some more hedgerows or some new hedges into the system. and that's sequestering. So those plants are growing, they're absorbing, and they're not young plants are ones that you're not cutting, you're not trimming them down. They're establishing themselves from a young plant into an adult plant, and that tends to be considered by the carbon footprinting tools as one of the areas where there's that time of growth is where there's the highest level of sequestration before that plant has become mature. Then it grows again, and so we're getting even more sequestration associated with that. And then once it's developed into a mature hedge, for instance, and you're managing it in the same way every year, but it's still established as a mature plant, you're not taking it right down or you're not digging it up effectively, then that is considered to be in equilibrium. So that soil carbon is now a stable store and has been sequestered. So you might still crop that in terms of cutting your hedge every 2 years, every 3 years, but it's a mature product that is there and it's being managed in a constant fashion. So therefore you have increased your carbon, above ground carbon, by having an increased level of vegetation on that farm associated with that hedge. So if you do changes to that, so for instance, if you are cutting on a more regular basis, or you're taking that hedgerow down to a much lower height, then obviously you're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So the amount of what that carbon store is contributing to your farm becomes less. So if you've got these wood stores on the farm and it remains stored until that wood is harvested. So if we think about maybe you've got some forestry or woodland that you would be actually using for commercial timber, the impact of that harvest depends on what happens to that timber afterwards as well. So that's worth thinking about as regarding commercial timber. So if you use that wood in building materials and permanent infrastructure, then that remains locked up and it's still a store of carbon. But if it's burnt for energy and the carbon's released, so if you're using that in terms of some of your biomass on your farm, then or that's being taken off your farm for biomass, then there would need to be technologies associated with extracting that carbon out of that that's been released into the air, and then looking to recycle that back in. Otherwise, it becomes a source of emission. And then the sequestration work that you've done, either overtly or inadvertently associated with that woodland, would be lost. So in terms of carrying sequestration out on your farm practically, you'd be looking at trying to increase the length, the breadth and the height of your hedgerows, for example, maybe increase the number of trees on the farm, increase your soil organic carbon levels, look at the application of organic fertilizers to displace your artificial fertilizer use, maybe use of cover crops, and maybe increase use of legumes as well. Now, most of you on this call, I would imagine, already do quite a lot of these, if not all of them. And then that's where you start to get in a situation where it's useful to actually assess what you already do on your farm, undertaking a carbon footprint, which we'll talk about a bit later on. So this explains it a little bit more in terms of grassland. Now, I don't want you to get too upset by some of the terminology on this, because it talks about poor management and improved management. That's associated with the management of the carbon stock. It's not associated with the agricultural management systems that you're choosing to use. So I just wanted to, this is a visual to try and help you understand and see visually a little bit about grassland carbon sequestration. So effectively, we're talking here that under constant long-term management of, say, a native undisturbed grassland, so it may well be a grassland system that's been there for a very long time, a permanent pasture system, or undisturbed native grassland system, the amount of carbon is constant long-term. You still have that cyclical increase and decrease of carbon associated with cropping by livestock, but there's no increase in long-term storage, so it's a stable store. But if you switch to that land to a more intensive system, so maybe with a higher stocking rate or more frequent ploughing or taking more cuts of silage than you did previously, you then end up lowering the carbon capacity of that system, and carbon will be lost until you reach that new equilibrium point, which you can see there on the graph there. But then also conversely, that's not necessarily an irreversible process. You can, if you reduce that intensity of management, you can then look to start to raise that limit of that amount of carbon store within that soil system and start to increase carbon sequestration. and then get that back up to a equilibrium point. It may not be to the equilibrium point that was there in that first column, but you're in a position where you have got the opportunities to do that. So all farmers are in a position. One, it's useful to assess what you've got on the farm, and it tends to be that grazing systems that have reasonably high levels or percentage of permanent pasture on their farms tend to have a good quality carbon store there already, which may or may not have been assessed accurately to date, but that's something that the farmers in Wales, livestock farmers in Wales, are contributing actively already by protecting that carbon store within their permanent pasture. But if you're looking at cultivating to grow higher volumes of intensive grassland systems, then there are different ways that you may want to think about doing that if you're interested in this side of things. The next topic I've got here is around this concept of GWP. So this is this global warming potential that we referred to. And here I've tried to use those three areas to explain nitrous oxide, methane and carbon dioxide, but try to put it in the context of global warming potential. And the discussion around GWP 100 versus GWP star is that this GWP 100 is the system that's used internationally by the IPCC to establish and compare carbon and greenhouse gas emissions across the world for all different sectors, not just agriculture. And it's something that's been agreed by nations across the world as the tool to use to try and have something that's looking at getting comparable figures across different systems. It estimates global warming potential over 100 years. And as I say, it's used by all the official organisations to try and work towards a common goal associated with global warming and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So as many of you already know, methane has a very high global warming potential, as was shown by the figures that we use in terms of the CO2 emissions, but it is short-lived. So these two terms that are being used, so over a 20-year period, it's got a global warming potential of 86. Over 100 it's looking at, 100 is a 100-year period, is looking at 28. So you can see here that methane has global warming potential 28 over 12 years. So it disappears much more rapidly than, say, nitrous oxide or carbon dioxide does. And just to provide you a little bit more context to the difference between these two systems, is that to try and help you understand this a bit better, reducing emissions, if you start to reduce methane emissions now, that will result in cooling in approximately 12 years' time. But reducing CO2 emissions now, specifically CO2 emissions as opposed to methane, will still contribute to warming for hundreds of years. So the top graph there shows how, if we reduce both methane emissions and CO2 emissions at the same time, you do get a reduction in emission. But the impact of that in terms of its global warming potential is completely different. So CO2, even if we reduce our emissions or even stop our emissions, dramatically reduce them now, we've still got a global warming happening for a much longer period of time, whereas we'll start to be in a cooling position if we reduce the same amount of methane, and it would happen much sooner. And the GWP star system tries to take account of that. So that's why a lot of the livestock industry has got very interested in GWP star, because of course the majority of a significant amount of the emissions from the from livestock comes from the methane side of things. So that's where that narrative has come from. Having talked about that though, the reality is that globally, when we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, which are not only from agriculture, they come from a range of sources. As you well know, it isn't just agriculture that contributes to this. Anything associated with human activity produces greenhouse gas emissions. The certifying bodies and IPCC are not likely to move from using the global warming GWP 100. That's something that they will continue to use. So agriculture still needs to be in a position where it's using something that's comparable and able to be compared against all of the other sectors as well. And we don't want to be in a situation whereby saying, oh, well, if you stop the methane side of things, then the livestock sector, it's all okay, because of course it isn't. And the livestock sector, part of agriculture, wants to make sure that it's contributing towards this reduction in CO2 and is currently doing so as part of this aspiration towards net zero. So this one of the reasons for encouraging the industry to use GWP 100 is, one, primarily so that it can be compared effectively against other sectors, and we can be part of that narrative as opposed to sitting outside of that, but also to make sure that we don't end up in this position where there's complacency within the sector. Fundamentally, as it says at the bottom there, no matter how you measure and report greenhouse gas emissions, the key is to change practice on farm. Fundamentally, it is about what can we do on our own farming systems, and how can we do that in a way that works for us as farmers, and still means that we're able to produce food in a way that's got a good environmental footprint and continues to do so, and is able to be branded appropriately from Wales within the UK. So participating in GWP 100 is really important, to be able to be at that table and then be able to say, this is what we're doing as an industry and within our own individual sectors. So talking about changing practice on farm, I'm moving on a little bit now to talking about carbon calculators, which again, you'll have heard quite a bit about within the farming press. And these are really useful tools. They do come with health warnings, but they are still very, very useful tools in terms of starting to help identify key sources of emission, fundamentally being able to give a baseline of activity, and then inform how to look to reduce and to develop a model going forward, so that giving those individuals within the sector something to work with. And then also they help determine the scale and what opportunity areas there are to work with in terms of looking at either protecting existing stores or looking to sequester or at least manage carbon emissions. So they don't tell you how to reduce emissions on farm. That would be the action planning process that follows a carbon footprint, but they do help provide a baseline in order for us to work on in terms of moving forward. So what does a footprint include? Tend to assess emissions from 1 full year of production, so that's 12 months. That already brings to some degree some challenges around livestock production systems that don't fall within 1 year. The carbon footprinting tools, some of them work most effectively for arable systems or for short livestock production systems such as pigs or poultry, or potentially sheep as well. For beef systems, the tools are still being adapted and being developed in order to make them much more effective for that process. But the things, they're still there and they're still valuable to use. There's just various ways of making sure that we get the right sort of figures into them, particularly around production cycles that cross a 12-month period. We're looking at embedded emissions, so those that come with emissions that are associated from outside the farm gate, so purchase feed, fertilizers, consumables, but then the emissions from the application process of nitrogen fertilizers, so the application of those onto the land, emissions from livestock manures and the applications associated with those. These are what we call enteric emissions, so what the actual animals themselves emit, what the ruminants emit themselves, and then embedded emissions from energy production and combustion, so purchasing the fuel that you use on the farm, the electricity, and the associated emissions from the production of that electricity, and then the combustion of those of fuel on the farm itself. And then, as I say, embedded emissions from purchased livestock. So again, if you're buying livestock onto the farm, you haven't created those livestock from scratch from your farm system. They're coming just as purchase feed, fertilizer and consumables. They're coming with their own emissions associated with their production systems that you had nothing to do with, but you've effectively brought those onto the farm. So choosing a carbon calculator, there's 3 logos there of 3 that are commonly known about within the UK. I'm going to talk in particular about 2 of them, which is CFT, the Cool Farm tool, and also AgriCalc. But before you get anywhere near jumping into using any of these tools or working with discussion groups or consultants who are using these tools with you, it's important for you to be clear about what it is that you actually want to do yourself. So why are you assessing emissions? Are you interested in what's happening along the whole supply chain? Or are you interested in what's happening across the farm as a whole? Some of these tools, particularly Cool Farm tool, has been developed to look at particular products or product along a supply chain. So as it says here, what is the system boundary? Are you looking at a particular product? Is it about milk, or is it about liquid milk, or is it about lamb, or is it about beef, or is it about the enterprise associated with that? So just that production in the farm or across the whole farm, or whether you're actually looking at the whole farm system that you're running. Accommodating the mixed activities that you do on that farm, and also accommodating for any of the sequestration activities or renewable energy activities that you do on that farm. So taking a whole farm approach. I would imagine that most people on this call, if you are interested in carbon footprinting, are probably interested in what happens on your farm as a whole. But as I say, that there are specific areas there, particularly for the industry as a whole. They might be interested in, well, what's the carbon footprint associated with milk production? Or maybe what's the carbon footprint associated with milk production into a specific processor or retailer? Are you looking at using an off-the-shelf tool like some of the ones, the images that I've got there, the brands there, or are you looking at something bespoke? Quite often processors or supply chains are looking at a bespoke model for their particular sector to try and pull out particular things. And they can be developed by consultancies such as ADAS and others to try and do that. But most of the tools, including the ones that you can see there, most of these tools are free for farmers, but they're not free for consultants. So if you're needing some support from the consultants, then that might be something that needs to be factored in terms of accessibility. And that's something we'll talk about, particularly with the Farming Connect side of things towards the end of the presentation. No one tool gives the correct answer. I think that's a really important thing to say. You need that there. Different tools have been developed for different things, as I explained. So you need to choose the tool that helps answer the questions that you've got about your system and your sector. And the other thing to be reassured about, and this is both quite enabling, but it can also be quite frustrating, is that it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. You don't need to know to the nth degree what's happening on your farming system regarding all of your inputs and outputs. You need to be able to have a really good informed guess. This is like filling out your BPS form. This is about getting a really good understanding, your best guess of what's happening within the system. And all of these tools have standardized figures associated with them. So therefore, it's important that you have a good go at it and try and be as accurate as you can, but don't get too bogged down in it, because what you're ultimately moving towards is wanting to be in a system where you can be you can look at how your system maybe compares to others, either within your own local discussion group or within your sector. Or more, you might be in this situation where you just want to compare a change in practice on your farm year on year, so that as long as you use the same methodology year on year, then you're in a situation where that's still useful for yourself. So this is information that actually has been put together by the NFU, asking farmers who've participated in some of their net zero activity what the tools measure well, and then also talk about what the tools measure less well. So they tend to measure changes in productivity really well, because that's something that would be quite clear in terms of how much kilograms were produced year on year, or what's going on within that system. It does that very well. The embedded side of things, it tends to capture both embedded emissions from fertilizer manufacture and from purchased feed pretty well. Again, they're figures that can be got from the sector of production and factored in pretty easily. So that's the tools accommodate that well. It's also quite easy to be quite clear about fuel usage and get that into the system, and it assesses that well. It tends to look at manure management quite well in terms of how you manage your manures, and also looking at volumes of manures, and tends to think about fertilizer volumes and application pretty well as well. They tend to do that quite easily. So that's good. What they're less good at is providing an insight in mitigation practices. So I've already talked about they don't tell you what you should do. Part of the reason is that's not what they're designed for. But the other part of the reason is, as soon as you start to get into mitigation practices, it gets a lot harder to be general, give good quality general advice, when every single farming system is different and bespoke. So that's where we start to get into, you could consider this, or you might want to consider that, as opposed to being providing evidence, hardcore advice that's definitely appropriate for a range of systems. They're less good at looking at embedded emissions from purchased livestock. So buying that livestock in, the livestock you can buy into systems varies greatly, doesn't it? And being able to be clear about what you're getting when you buy that in, what carbon footprint that you're getting when you buy that in, can be hard. And likewise, it can be quite difficult for, say, store cattle systems, for instance, where you're buying something in and then you're not actually, it's not a suckler herd system, you're selling it off again. Making sure that the tools reflect that accurately, for instance, can be challenging. And then carbon sequestration. So this is a big area that obviously everybody's really, really interested in. The reason the tools tend to not do it so well is it's really hard to do. Getting this right and getting it accurate has been something that's really challenging because there's so many variables and there's a lot of unknowns, particularly associated with soil carbon as well. So one or two of the tools have a go at it, which is the right thing to do, but it does come with a health warning. So the skill tends to be in making sure that there is consistency around how tools are used. And of course, that can be a challenge if you've got lots of individual farmers using the tools. It tends to be something that you can iron a bit of that out when you've got a consultancy support associated with that. I would say that to some degree, but it is true in terms of getting consistency of application and consistency of information going into the system. And then making sure that you try and capture all of the emissions in some way, shape or form. So even if the tool doesn't have clear boxes to fill out, you have that conversation with yourself or with your consultant to make sure, have I captured all of the emissions associated with everything? And if I haven't, where else can I put it within the system to make sure that that's being accommodated for? So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about AgriCalc, which is available to yourselves to use through some of the Car Farming Connect support, as are the other tools as well. So as an example, this has been a tool that was produced, has been produced by SAC. They've used it on a range of farms in Scotland, and it's got quite a big Scottish database associated with it. Inevitably, that's all sorts of farming systems: arable, beef, sheep, mixed systems, to a lesser extent poultry and pigs. It is being used increasingly across farms in some farms in England, and we're now starting to see it being used more and more across farms in Wales as well. So the database of comparison, and you do get comparisons within your enterprise type with AgriCalc, as it says there on the slide, gets better and better the more farms are put through AgriCalc effectively. So the key one about this is that it's good at whole farm emissions, including mixed farms. So if you run, it'll look at your farm as a whole, and not just at one aspect of production within the farming system. And it does have a decent go at looking at mixed farming systems. There is a trade-off there associated with it becoming more complex, but nevertheless, the farming system, it effectively reflects the farming system that it's trying to capture information out of. So if you have a more complex farming system, then the process of doing AgriCalc is a little bit more complex as well. And the advantage also is that it splits by product. So not only do you get, so if you run a beef and a sheep system, you would get a whole farm carbon footprint for your beef and sheep system, but within that you would get information about your beef system and information about your sheep system. So you can really drill down into the different enterprises on the farm. It's quite good at capturing if you've got different herd structures, it tries to do that quite well. So it makes quite a big effort to deal with, particularly with these production systems that cross over a year, more than a 12-month period, such as a suckler system. And then it does try to capture any productivity changes that you're doing either within that year, or so you might be growing 2 crops on one piece of land, for instance, in terms of doing catch crops, for instance, it tries to capture that, or whether you're doing it across years. These assessments are detailed and they are repeatable, so you can do them again and again, using year after year or within every 5 years, or whatever suits you in terms of the system. And then you can copy assessments, so you can make a copy of the one that you've done for last year, and then you can play around with the figures. So you can use it as a bit of a what if scenario to try and say, well, what if I did this? How would that impact on my carbon footprint? As I've already said, you can benchmark against other farms within the system, so that's quite useful. And then it does have a soil carbon module, which is very new. So they're having a go at trying to look at the soil carbon aspect of your farm, of the farming system, and that does try to capture any work that you're doing or practices that you've got, particularly around low or min-till practices in particular. So the disadvantages are the user interface is not particularly user-friendly. You need to be pretty okay with your figures and be able to mess around with different tabs and spreadsheets, etc. And it can take a long time to complete, as I've already said, for these complex systems. It does have limited fertilizer and feed options. So quite often, if you've got a range, you use quite a wide range of fertilizers or quite a wide range of feed, you need to fudge that information in terms of getting that into the system. So you can still accommodate for it, but it's not particularly clear. And then, as I say, that they are looking, as most of these, as the next one is as well, looking at producing new releases. So they're trying to change it and adapt it to reflect and be more accurate as the industry demands effectively. So Cool Farm Tool, CFT, the advantages are associated for this. It's good at looking at products. So it's good at looking at a beef system or a sheep system, kilograms of beef or kilograms of lamb or kilograms of potatoes or volume of milk for cheese, volume of liquid milk. It's pretty simple and fast. It's a fairly easy tool to use to get an initial assessment. It doesn't necessarily delve down into whole farm detail, but you do get a good quality initial assessment. And then you can benchmark within your sector, within your product, as it were. And then it does do much more around giving you a footprint that accommodates for biodiversity and for water use. The water use side of things in particular reflects the fact that Cool Farm Tool was developed in part for use on a global scale, particularly if there was water scarcity being an issue, which obviously isn't something necessarily that we see at the moment within a Welsh context, but that's where some of that comes from. And then it tries to account for emissions from land use change. So if you're looking at changing the land use and accommodate and bring that into that enterprise, then it's quite good at accounting for that. And it does have lots of different options for fertilizer application. That in part is reflected by the fact I think it was originally developed primarily for an arable system, but now it does mean that there is that feature which is useful for more complex agricultural systems. And then there is particularly because it's been used particularly for quite a lot of intensive feeding systems, there's a detailed feed module there as well to be really clear to get that level of accuracy. But as I've already inferred, you need to do each enterprise separately. If you wanted to get that whole farm report and you have a range of products that you produce, you need to do all of those separately to then put those pieces of the jigsaw together to get a whole farm report, which is not something AgriCalc does. A whole farm starts out from that whole farm position. And you can't really do any public benchmarking. You need to be part of the Cool Farm Alliance, which is predominantly retailer and processor led in order to get a data set. So this is why this tends to be a tool that's been used by processors and retailers because it's something that they are able to access as members of the Cool Farm Alliance. But it is still there for farmers to access as well. As I say, it tends to be used for enterprise, as in product or supply chain side of things. As I said there, again, just to say that Cool Farm Tool is also releasing a new version again because they're acknowledging that there is a need for updated figures and something that's relevant for the industry as this becomes more and more important for the sector. So for carbon calculators, I've given you probably way more detail than you needed, but I just wanted to make sure that you got that clarity and hopefully it was understandable for yourselves. They're really useful in terms of understanding hotspots, either along a supply chain or on a farm, and you can really identify where the main hotspots are regarding emissions. It can try and they can provide you with a basis of information for you to focus activities. And then also what you might need to do to get a scale of change in terms of what is it that you could tinker around with but not get much change, or whether it's something much more substantial you need to do in terms of getting some significant change if that's possible for yourself and something that you're interested in. So carbon footprinting doesn't sort out your carbon emissions at all, but they provide you with something to work with. And they need to be interpreted in the context of the farm and your production system producing food and kilograms of food. And there might be key elements missing. You just need to be in a position where you acknowledge that and understand that as a caveat. And they're really useful. Lots of people have said, well, I've had a carbon footprint done, but what does that mean to me? It doesn't mean anything. It's just a figure. The thing that people are often interested in is, well, what does that mean in terms of me moving forward to the actions that I think the management that I'm proposing to do anyway, or the ones that I could think about, will that increase or decrease my carbon footprint? And that might have been something that was a very much an optional extra 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but now is increasingly something that farmers are more and more interested in having that conversation at least. And then that direction of change over time is more important than the snapshot. So I've done a range of AgriCalc, for instance, on farms for the last production cycle, the previous production cycle, and for several of the products, the carbon footprint for those products is really, really high. But you've got to understand, of course, that it may well be to do with the fact that the weather was very poor that year, so therefore they got very low yields. So that one snapshot is valuable, but it doesn't provide the whole story, and hence why, like anything to do with benchmarking, it's the information is more and more useful the more often you do it. So some of this stuff I've said implicitly, but I just wanted to make sure that you you'd picked up on stuff that you probably already feel quite strongly about. If you're thinking about assessing what your carbon footprint is, you need to participate in some sort of carbon footprinting activity. That measuring that baseline is really important. But then most agricultural systems in the UK, what they've got to go at, there's still something they can do around protecting and reducing their carbon footprint, and it's around production efficiency. So I just wanted to show I just wanted to show some of the tools that Farming Connect have started to develop for that, which helps really illustrate this side of things. So this is where I spend quite a little bit of my time helping and encouraging and advising farmers, because reducing greenhouse gas emissions is really still very much around increasing profitability. And the sort of things that this tool here is helping, I mean, they're stuff that hopefully you're already aware of yourselves. Production efficiency is something that you're interested in yourself. If you participate in production efficiency, you're very likely to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions on your farm already. So this is a sort of dialogue and narrative that Farming Connect is there to help you with effectively. And then I just wanted to finally finish off. So as I say, measuring that baseline is really important, and then working through the opportunity areas for yourself. And the carbon footprint tools do help you look at opportunity areas, particularly if you have support and advice to start to put together an action plan, looking at what will have the most impact as regards reducing your carbon footprint, but also more fundamentally, what's actually feasible for you as a farmer. And then thinking through sort of short, medium and long-term changes as well. So lots of the changes are ones that maybe you need a medium to long-term approach on. And for quite a lot of agricultural and livestock systems, that's completely appropriate. So you'd be looking at a long-term approach in terms of making changes, which would affect, which runs alongside maybe any production efficiency changes you were looking to do on the farm as well. And then finally, I just wanted to make sure that if you were interested in some of the geeky stuff around carbon footprinting, then these tools here are useful. So there's a report there looking at comparison of carbon calculators and on-farm emission sources. DEFRA has put together with a range of scientists a mitigation methods user guide. And then HDB have put together with scientists rapid evidence assessments for both dairy, cereals and oilseeds, and they're looking towards doing such a thing for beef and sheep systems as well. I've shown you that Farming Connect interactive farm, and then I also wanted to promote to you the opportunities that are coming up now through your Farming Connect discussion groups around doing carbon footprinting as a group. If you're interested in doing that in small groups, then your development officer will be able to tell you a little bit about that. And then some of the approved advisors, which would include the ADAS advisors, will be able to work with you to go through a carbon footprinting tool and then develop action plans that you can discuss together as a group. And that's fully funded through Farming Connect. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that as well. So that's about it from me. I hope I didn't go on too long. If there's any questions, as I say, I am not a scientific expert. I've come at it very much in terms of trying to understand it myself and then hopefully be useful for yourselves in terms of thinking, what do these terms mean, etc. But if there's anything you want to have a chat about, or if there's anything that you'd like me to take away and then get back to you through Farming Connect in terms of more details and information, I'd be very happy to do so. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. And yeah, as you said, carbon footprinting, it's a very complex area. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions, and yeah, definitely, I've certainly found it useful for one anyway. Yes, we have had some questions through, so I'll quickly whiz through some of those. I'm quite conscious of time, but we have some time left to go through some questions. Right, so first of all, why do farmers have to account for the emissions from fertilizer nitrogen production when the fertilizer manufacturers are also trying to achieve net zero? Is this potentially double counting?
The sector as a whole is looking at that, but you're in a position where you could potentially use the opportunity to say, okay, well, they come with fertilizer, they come with emissions. The carbon footprinting isn't necessarily used to compare the industry against the fertilizer manufacturers. It's much more to do with looking at it within agriculture itself, and it does help. The use of that embedded emissions is a useful thing to use when you're trying to compare the value or otherwise of using your organic manures as a source of N versus artificial fertilizers. So I think that's a valid statement if you're starting to compare agriculture alongside fertilizer manufacturers, but the carbon footprinting activities we tend to be involved in is looking at it within an agricultural setting.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And another one, is there any way of taking into account non-farming diversification activities within the calculators?
Okay, so I'll explain what I know about AgriCalc. So AgriCalc accommodates for renewable energy production and the use of that renewable energy on a farming system. It doesn't account for the use of, say, the production of renewable energy on a system that's on the farm but not associated with the farm business. So anything within the farm business is accommodated for. I have had dialogue with farmers where we've discussed tried to capture what else happens on the farm. So effectively that's an offsetting activity. We haven't talked about offsetting overtly today, where there's the carbon footprint associated with the agricultural production systems are calculated, and then what happens elsewhere within the farmer's control, but outside of that business, they say, well, that will offset that side of things. AgriCalc does look at the soil sequestration side of things and tries to capture what that means in terms of offsetting your production footprint. So that is something that is looked at.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. And how realistic are some of the net zero targets? There's quite a few floating about, and yeah, just your thoughts on that, really.
I think it's good to have targets. I'm not in a position to say whether it's good or bad, really, but it's about the industry having something to work towards. And I think all that does is really reiterate the importance of the industry actually understanding what it already does. So I think that's where the likes of the soil carbon sequestration stuff, there's been a real momentum around that, because if we can have good, clear evidence about what is done already, and we currently aren't able to capture that data effectively and understand that, then we're not representing the industry in a fair light. Whether that's a positive or negative view, it doesn't matter, but it's really, really important to make sure that we really ramp up the level of assessment and the accuracy associated with those assessments in order to help the industry start to move towards being able to work out whether it can or can't work towards net zero effectively.
Definitely. And just a nice question to finish off. If somebody's starting to look at their carbon footprinting, where would you say is the best place for them to start? Let's go straight in.
Well, I know it's a bit of I would say that, wouldn't I? But I would start off for yourself. If you're a farmer just going, what do I do? How do I start off? I would start off with the Farming Connect models and services, just because they're accessible. There's support there funded to help you understand what on earth might be useful for you on the farm, and it's a route that you may be already familiar with. There's work being done by a whole range of well thought of and renowned organisations that are feeding into that system, and we have some of those in Wales. We've got Bangor University, as I mentioned, SAC, we've got IBIS who are participating in these things, and the likes of Farming Connect basically pull out a range of useful tools and useful experts associated with that. And that would include the likes of ADAS. As I've said, ADAS provide independent advice to a range of customers, both in terms of government, at a government level, national level, and also on an on-farm level, to try and help farmers navigate their way through what can feel quite complicated and also a very emotive and judgmental topic, actually. So yeah, I would start off with Farming Connect and then navigate your way through there and find out what's right for you to answer the questions that you've got about your own system and how you want to manage your system long term, really.
That's brilliant. So thank you very much, Helen. And again, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for your presentation. Yourself and and I mentioned a bit about the support available at the start of the webinar. Just to reiterate your words, really, yes, there's plenty of support out there, and it's about, you know, getting hold of it and, you know, making a start, I suppose. So yeah, I'd like to encourage everybody to make the most of the support that's available. You can do so by either contacting your local development officer, or you'll see a feedback form at the end of the webinar. So I would encourage you to put a note in there if you are interested. And yeah, just before we finish off, I'd like to thank you, Helen, for the presentation, and obviously to yourselves as participants for joining us tonight, and wish you all a good evening, and thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Hwyl nawr.